Okay, great. Great to see everybody. I am Jamie Cope with the WVU Industrial Extension. Welcome. Glad to have you here for today's webinar, which is creating a process map with Randy Kowalczyk. And a lot of you may not know Randy. He's fairly new to our group, but we're really excited to have him on board. He's been a great addition to our team, doing a lot of the lean work and things like that. So I'm going to turn it over to Randy here in just a second, but just a few housekeeping things first. We've got the chat set up, so if you have any questions, be sure and put those in the chat. And if you have any comments, we'll definitely be addressing all of those at the end of the webinar. Maybe if it's really timely, we'll do it in the middle as well. Also, I wanted to say a special thank you for Gestamp. I'm coming to you live from South Charleston, West Virginia at Gestamp, which our manufacturers are just the coolest. We did this from Brake Supply and Beaver, and now we're in South Charleston, Gestamp. So lots of fun to get out and about and meet with our manufacturers and work with them. And also fun that they let us use their facilities. So I'm going to turn it over to Randy. So have fun, Randy.
Always. Thank you, Jamie. All right. If you came here to tune into the Mountaineer basketball game at 11:30, you have came to the wrong place. Jamie informed me it was unprofessional and mildly illegal to stream the game during the webinar. So I just want to let everybody know that I tried. Like Jamie said, some of you may not know me. I'm the newest member of the Industrial Extensions team. I started here in October, so I still have that new employee smell. My name is Randy Kowalczyk, and I'm the manager of continuous improvement. The Industrial Extension team is tasked with supporting organizations throughout West Virginia with a variety of needs. I specifically assist with workforce and continuous improvement needs, such as leadership development and training, lean manufacturing principles, job instruction development, and work instruction development, to name a few. I graduated from West Virginia University with a Bachelor of Science, and I've spent a little more than 10 years in industry. Early in my career, I was running a forklift and stacking 50-pound bags. As I gained experience, I had the opportunity to get into management. Then I primarily focused on production efficiency while working with regulatory bodies, helping maintain site security, and explaining technical information to customers on products or processes. For those of you that may not know, the WVU Industrial Extension partners with small and medium-sized manufacturers in West Virginia to support operational improvement and business growth. As part of West Virginia University, the Industrial Extension serves the university's land grant mission and is housed in the Statler College of Engineering and Mineral Resources. As West Virginia's one and only affiliate to the NIST MEP National Network, the WVU Industrial Extension is part of a nationwide program of centers tasked with supporting the manufacturing community. This unique arrangement provides the Industrial Extension the opportunity to support the manufacturing community from a national, state, and local level. The WVU Industrial Extension focuses on developing consulting services that reflect our client needs, provide hands-on education, and work one-on-one with our clients to deliver practical solutions in areas of workforce, occupational health and safety, management systems, operational improvement, advanced manufacturing, leadership development, and innovation and growth services. Before we get started today, I want to remind you that we have some webinars coming up. You can find a complete list of webinars and workshops in the events section of our website. All webinars run from 11 to 12 unless otherwise noted, and they're free of charge. I won't go through the entire list, but there are currently 7 planned between now and early May. They cover a wide variety of topics that are important to anyone who works in or supports manufacturing. I will be doing next week's job instruction webinar also. So if you leave today's webinar thinking, oh my, I can't listen to that guy 2 weeks in a row, then you have about a week to email Jamie and get me booted out. We started doing a safety minute at the beginning of every webinar. So my safety minute With spring right around the corner, I want to talk about a few misconceptions regarding thunderstorms. Contrary to what you hear, lightning often strikes the same place more than once, especially if it's a tall, pointy, isolated object. For instance, the Empire State Building gets hit nearly 100 times a year. Lightning often strikes more than 3 miles away from the center of a thunderstorm. It can actually strike up to 15 miles away. So even if you're not right in the thunderstorm, it doesn't mean you're safe. When in a vehicle, the rubber tires are not what saves you from lightning. Cars are safe from lightning, but it's the metal roof and the sides that protect you by letting the current run through the frame. Anything with an open top offers no protection. The human body does not store electricity. It is perfectly safe to touch a lightning victim to give them first aid. Avoid trees. You hear this a lot, but being underneath a tree is still the second leading cause of lightning casualties. Do not stop and lay flat. I don't know if somebody mixed this up with a tornado, but lying flat increases your chance of being affected by potential deadly ground current. If you are outside during a thunderstorm, just keep moving to get to a safe shelter. And a house is obviously a safe place to be during a thunderstorm, but you still want to avoid anything that conducts electricity and also windows. On to today's webinar. Today's webinar will focus on an introduction to process mapping. In my opinion, this is one of the most powerful, versatile, and important exercises in any business, manufacturing or not. Process mapping helps everyone truly understand what happens daily and how to improve. Like anything the industrial extension provides, we'll start with some education so you understand what process mapping is and why it's important. We'll then move on to some mapping tools, including SIPOC diagrams and process flow charts to help break down processes, and dig a little deeper to show you how turtle diagrams and process charts can add clarity. And finally, we'll wrap up with a couple of other process mapping tools that are very useful to consider. I'd like to start with an anonymous poll question. How often do you pull key members of the team together to review processes to proactively look for improvement opportunities? This does not include addressing complaints or problems on the plant floor.
And while we're waiting, I will add that our polls are anonymous, so we're not going to check up and give grades on this to individuals later.
All right. Looks like we have a nice split between 6 months and never, which is very, very common. 6 months, I thought that was pretty good. I thought it would be every few years or never. All right. So let us start with a simple question. What is process mapping? Process mapping is a set of activities to help you visualize a process in a way that you may not have in the past. Process mapping provides insight into what a business does. Sometimes we get so ingrained in our daily routine that we tend to overlook or lose sight of all the steps, touches, and activities that make our business successful day after day. How the business accomplishes what it does. Using a visual approach, process mapping allows you to identify and understand those steps, touches, and activities in a way that allow you to better understand the interconnections that you know exist, but have probably not thought about because you're so busy and have grown accustomed to things just working every day. Who is involved and what are their responsibilities? As you look at your process map, reviewing what the business does and how the business accomplishes what it does, you can also gain better perspective on who's involved in making the business a success and what their responsibilities are. This can be very helpful in understanding workload, staffing needs, training and development initiatives. What the customer requires from you. As you gain a better understanding of what, how, and who, this allows you to align your efforts with customer requirements and build customer satisfaction into your processes. Where challenges and opportunities exist. When you look at this information proactively, the conversation that led to development of the map and the visual representation of your processes will undoubtedly bring to light the challenges that you face and the opportunities to improve. This can be used to outline a continuous improvement plan. How success is measured. As you look at existing processes and identify those challenges and opportunities, you can also identify what success looks like. To be more specific, you can identify key performance indicators and measure your performance to those KPIs. Process maps are helpful in every aspect of your operation. As we saw in the previous slide, process mapping is a tool to help you understand the who, what, when, why, and how of a process. Because every process has an input and an output, process mapping can be applied to the front office side of the wall just as easily as the production side. Furthermore, the activity of applying this tool to your processes is an excellent way to break down the natural barriers often created by this wall. Now that we've identified all the processes can benefit from process mapping, let's talk about who should be part of the team to create these process maps. We want to gather people who complete the process as part of their daily responsibility. It is important to have varying levels of experience with the process to provide balance. Be aware, sometimes those most intimately familiar with the process will be extremely helpful, but they may struggle with keeping an open mind if efficiency is brought into question. This makes it necessary to round out the team with people who have little or no experience with the process. They will offer a new set of eyes to challenges and a fresh perspective to identify new opportunities. But the benefit of using a cross-functional team goes way beyond this. The time spent together creating this map provides team building moments. Through a clear understanding and appreciation for processes they may not be involved in regularly, if ever. So why is process mapping important? Chances are everyone on this webinar could jot down some notes about a process and get close. But keep in mind there are three sides to every process: what we think the process is, what the process actually is, and what we want the process to be. In our Introduction to Lean Manufacturing workshop, we teach basic lean principles through a classroom and hands-on approach, assembling circuit boards with springs, resistors, diodes, and LED lights. The parts all connect via springs, so imagine 2 or 3 components being installed on one spring. Human nature is to take the easiest path forward, so you just bend the spring back and install the component. But what many participants don't realize until later in the class is that taking that easy way out makes installation of additional components harder on their teammates further down the line, creating potential quality issues. For a more real-world example, we facilitated this process with a small father-son company. The father was preparing for retirement, and the son asked for help understanding the business. So we suggested using a process map to help chart the course for improvements he could make in the upcoming months and years. Just before lunch, we had come to a piece of the operation that involved an employee who worked for the father since the company started. In the father's eyes, this was a simple piece of the puzzle that we could map, discuss, then go to lunch. The person responsible joined our discussion, and then 2 hours later, we were finally done talking about this simple task. The father was surprised to see how involved the task had become over the years because he had always depended on this employee to do it, and that's what they did. There was never any mention of the extra time and complexity involved that added significant responsibility to the daily routine. I tell these stories because it highlights that we often only see processes through the lens of our responsibility. Outside of our task, we tend to theorize or speculate what problems exist elsewhere. Thus, what we think the process is. When we go about our day-to-day routine and rarely think about it until a problem arises, such as failing products, quality concerns, or lack of production, that's when we think about it. At that point, we learn what the process really is. As we investigate the process to understand what it really is, we naturally want to question the process and find ways to fix problems we've encountered. This allows us to modify the process to what we want it to be. Think back to the poll question I asked. Why do we wait until a problem forces us to have these conversations? What if we replaced problem solving with improving the process as motivation to gather these key people and talk about our processes? That's where process mapping really shines. Depending on where you look, you'll find that there are a variety of process maps. For the purpose of our conversation and based on experience, we're going to focus on SIPOC diagrams, flowcharts, turtle diagrams, and process charts. In case you're not familiar with any of these, I wanted to give you a quick visual so that you could get a little better idea as I go through these on the next slide. As we go through this webinar, we'll start with understanding the importance of identifying the purpose for our map. Then we will create a SIPOC diagram, which is an excellent high-level tool to identify the basics of a process. SIPOC stands for suppliers, inputs, process, outputs, and customers. The goal of this map is to help identify the scope of the activity. Once you have a SIPOC diagram, depending on your purpose, you can break down the processes identified in a SIPOC diagram using flowcharts. Flowcharts are used to identify the logical steps of a process using shapes and symbols to further understanding. As that flowchart is analyzed to look for the challenges and opportunities, it is not uncommon to come across a process step that is confusing or requires additional attention. You can certainly repeat the previous process to create a SIPOC and flowchart to further digest it, but you can always go a step deeper in using turtle diagrams or process charts to understand the process steps. A SIPOC or a turtle diagram provides high-level focus on inputs and outputs of a single process, including resources, team, process, and measure of success. A process chart is a simple way to collect important data about a process in real time. Using a table and a set of symbols, you can identify process details like value, non-value added operations, inspections, delays, storage, and other functions. At the end of this process, these tools will help us get to the continuous improvement, the plan, do, check, act cycle, so that we can approach the improvement opportunity with confidence because we truly understand the process we are trying to improve. Now, we're not having a coffee break, sit back down. Or if you want to take a coffee break, I can't really stop you. But what I can do is use the process of making a cup of coffee to apply some meaning to the maps I just explained. First, we need to identify a goal. Why are we mapping the process in making a cup of coffee? Just like yellow and blue make green, a combination of understanding the purpose of our process mapping activity and the level of detail to accomplish that purpose sets the goal for the activity. First, let's talk about the purpose of our map. What are we trying to accomplish? What problem are we trying to solve? Some examples could include identifying main business activities, understand sequence of events for a task, evaluate the process or business innovations, identify or establish roles and responsibilities. Once the purpose has been identified, think about the level of detail you want to include. Do you want a narrow focus or a wide scope? How deep do we want to go? Do we look at the process itself, or do we include support processes as well? Do we want to collect and analyze data as part of the activity, or as a separate activity? Identifying this information up front will not only provide a goal to keep the team on task, but it will also help answer questions about steps to include or not include as the activity gets underway. For the purpose of our coffee example, the goal will be to improve the coffee making process. Since we are looking at the coffee making experience as a whole, our purpose will be to identify the sequence of events that make a cup of coffee. This means our level of detail will remain fairly high. Now that we've identified the goal of our process map, let's start by creating the SIPOC diagram. Once again, SIPOC stands for suppliers, inputs, processes, outputs, and customers. The purpose of a SIPOC diagram is to capture high-level knowledge of a total process so you can break down the operation into other maps for further understanding or help state the definition and scope of an improvement project. The goal of a SIPOC diagram is to set boundaries for an improvement project where we can use the information gathered to identify improvement opportunities, the scope of work, who needs to be part of the improvement team, and what stakeholders should be kept in communication. To start a SIPOC diagram, we begin with the boxes you see on the slide. Now that we have those boxes, let's start to fill them in. First, let's focus on the process itself by identifying the start and end point, which would be adding water, then adding cream to taste. Next, let's list all of the high-level process steps to get from start to finish. As a general rule, you should have no more than 7 or 8 steps since this is just a high-level starting point. Let's shift our attention to outputs. When the process is complete, what do you have? Some questions to help with this step would be to think about what is delivered, what is made, or what information is produced. Now that the outputs have been identified, let's focus on the customer. Who uses benefits from the outputs? A couple of tips to keep in mind. Outputs can have more than one customer. And when we talk about the customer, we traditionally mean the external customer. But it's important to remember that depending on the process, we can also have internal customers. At this point, we have our process, outputs, and customers defined. So what outputs do we require in terms of raw materials, resources, and information to deliver outputs? Think about the output of other processes that lead to the process or materials purchased from outside suppliers in your supply chain. It is important to note process steps can often have many inputs, so clearly think through the process. The final piece to creating this diagram is to identify the suppliers of the inputs. Consider each of the inputs noted and think about who provides that material or information. Looking at the information here, we have a great start, but think about our goal. Does the information provided here help us improve the coffee making experience? No. It helps us with a better picture of who is impacted and who impacts the process, what the process is. In some cases, if our goal is different, say to identify who is impacted by the coffee making process, this would be fine and likely a good stopping point. However, if we want to improve the experience, we need more information. To gather the information, we have to dig a little deeper. As you can see, we have taken steps identified in the process section and translated them into a flow chart to begin making the process visual. To dig a little deeper into the process steps outlined in the SIPOC diagram, we're going to use the process mapping tool called a flow chart. Chances are you've all seen flow charts before, but we're going beyond the basics to make this a very powerful tool. Think back to the SIPOC diagram for a moment. This is likely what you would tell me if I asked you about the process or the way you think it works. As you can see here, there's a lot of additional detail we overlooked. That is because we're looking at the process to identify what really happens. First, I want to comment on the layout. What I've shown you here is something that I would like to provide to you in a finished report with recommendations about improvement opportunities. As you read this from top to bottom, left to right, the map makes perfect sense. But as we create these, we want to try to keep the process in a straight line. I'll touch more on that in a couple of slides. Next, I want to draw your attention to various shapes you see on the map. The rounded edge box for start and stop identifies the first thing we do and the last thing we do. The square boxes are the process steps needed to complete the task. The diamond shapes are decision points. Is there some variation here? The box for coffee brews looks a little different than the rest because it is a sub-process. We could really investigate that and turn it into a whole separate process map if we needed to. These shapes are important because they help us communicate what is happening in the map. Since this is a fairly simple process, we will be using basic flowchart symbols here. But keep in mind, you can use the symbols as necessary. You can change the symbols as necessary for your specific process. The only requirement is to keep a legend or a key for the shapes so those reviewing the map will understand what it means. Some instances may go a step further to color code the map, with colors identifying divisions, departments, or roles and responsibilities. Now that the mechanics are out of the way, let's quickly compare what we think happens versus what really happens. First, we didn't address turning on the Keurig. If that's not on, all the other steps are wasted energy. We know that we need to add water, but shouldn't we at least check to see if there's water already first? Without a K-cup, there's no coffee. But think about the quality issues that would arise from using someone else's spent K-cup. We all know that we need a cup to put the coffee in, but if we don't know where to get the cup, how much time would be wasted looking for the cup and interrupting people doing other important tasks to see where the cups are stored? When we prepare the coffee to taste, what about locating the creamer and the sweetener? Where are they located? What kind is available? These options could greatly impact the time to complete the process and ultimately lead to an unhappy customer. And finally, we just assume that it's warm enough. We don't check with our customer to see if it's exactly what they want. Those types of decisions lead to customers to look for new vendors. I understand that I'm making a really big deal out of making a cup of coffee, But when you translate this into something real in your business, the shorter "what do we think happens" may not be wrong. But it also leaves out a lot of the important steps that could be creating challenges that negatively impact your business. You could also change things to improve sales, the bottom line, or customer satisfaction. That's why it's important to focus on what really happens, not just what we think happens. Now that you've seen what a finished flow chart looks like, I want to take a step back and walk you through the process to create a flow chart as a team activity. For the sake of time and space, I'm going to focus on preparing to make the cup of coffee. For tools and materials, we recommend using multiple colors of sticky notes or Post-it notes because they're big, simple, visual, easy to move. You can add them, replace them as you get new information during the discussion. Also, you'll want to identify a parking lot. A parking lot is a place to put ideas that we can't address right now, but we don't want to forget about later. A lot of discussion is going to take place, and some of that will likely be out of the scope for this event, or conversations that do not impact the whole group, or process questions that we don't know how to answer just yet. All of these items would be what goes into the parking lot. Onto the map. The first of 6 rounds, we want to focus on capturing the process. Using Post-it or sticky notes to identify the start point and the end point. That will set the boundaries for our mapping activity. Once those points have been added, we use the same color notes to add all the process steps between start and finish. As you list these activities, be short and to the point. Try limiting to just 2 or 3 words, including a noun and a verb. On this first pass, we do not analyze the process. We do that in later rounds. The goal of the round is to just identify the process. If analysis or questions do come up, use a parking lot or a space to denote these comments for inclusion and discussion at some other point. In round 2 of 6, let's take a minute to really look at the process. Remember, something I've said a couple times already. What we think happens isn't really what happens. So let's try to focus on what really happens. Think about workarounds, common problems that are accepted as part of everyday life, and the arch enemy of continuous improvement. That would be your "we've always done it this way," or "it was too hard to do it the way you wanted, so I found a shortcut." As you can see here, we've added 2 new decision points and steps that are very important to the process. Again, this would be a good reason for using Post-it notes because we can move the existing steps around to make room for new steps that we need to add. Judging on the level of detail to include on a process map can be a lot like going down a rabbit hole. Before you know it, you're looking at steps of steps of steps of steps. So when is enough enough? While there's no correct answer to this question, the goal of the process map should always be questioned when adding process steps. Are the process steps you're thinking about adding directly related to the goal outlined, or do they just support a step that is directly related to the goal? If the steps do not directly relate to the goal, they should not be added. If you're not sure, place the process map in the parking lot until you can further determine. Let's apply this to our map. If you remember our initial SIPOC diagram, we've identified the need to add water. After further review, we updated the map to add the steps to check water levels first. We added this because adequate water levels are necessary for our process. But do you think we should include process steps required to get the water needed? While adding water is an important step for our process, how we get it is not. We just need to get the water. So if we want to better understand how this impacts the process in question, we should create a new map for getting the water if necessary. In round 3 of 6, think about the steps in the process and what they really mean to the process. Do they add value? Are they non-value added but still necessary? Are they the result of one of the 8 wastes of lean? Is it something the customer is willing to pay for? As you analyze the map and ask these questions, identify the tasks with different color Post-it notes. While you can certainly use colors however you like, we recommend using green for something the customer will pay for, yellow for non-value added but still necessary, and red for non-value added or waste. You can see here that checking the water, retrieving the coffee cup, retrieving the K-cup have all been noted as non-value added but still necessary, and checking for a lingering K-cup is non-value added. In round 4 of 6, let's look a little deeper into the process steps we've identified as non-value added but necessary, and the non-value added. Using pink Post-it notes will justify our thought process for identifying the process steps we have. As we've noted here, manually adding water can lead to a fall hazard if it's overfilled and spilled. Locating a clean coffee cup is not only a non-value added task, but something the customer should not pay for. With so many flavors of K-Cups, it can be hard to locate what you want because there's no organization, and that lack of organization has led to a first in, first out process not being followed. Removing a used K-Cup from the Keurig not only takes extra time, but it can result in additional waste versus traditional coffee makers. In round 5 of 6, go back through the map from beginning to end and identify action items, improvements, and areas for further investigation. These items are identified, and then you add them with a blue Post-it note. As you can see here, some of the ideas gathered include consideration for hard plumbing a water line to avoid having to fill the coffee maker. This will not only eliminate the problem, but also the step of checking for adequate water. Review the procedures for cleaning coffee cups to determine if the job instruction needs updated or if you need a refresher or additional training. Organization of the kitchen through a 5S event and minimizing the number of K-Cup options could easily solve this problem. Collecting cycle times to see how much time is actually added by removing a K-Cup as part of the process once the coffee is done versus before the next cup is brewed. Looking for a bio-friendly K-Cup alternative could minimize the environmental impact created by landfilling used K-Cups. In the final round, review the improvement opportunities as a team and rank them in order. If the general consensus among the team is not obvious, consider asking each team member to rank the improvement opportunities in order of importance. Once they have all been ranked, start with the opportunities that receive the most votes. For the purpose of our exercise, we're going to focus on the following. Review the cleaning procedure for coffee cups because this is a low cost, no cost option, and the cleanliness prevents health risk in the office. We will then focus on conducting a 5S event to add better organization and labeling to the kitchen so we stop wasting K-Cups. We will conduct research to identify the top 3 flavors for the office to help with organization and minimize the money spent on office coffee. A side note to this recommendation, since research for bio-friendly cups was suggested, it'll be wrapped up in this recommendation as part of a supplier sourcing project. To summarize the 6 rounds we just completed, we focused on identifying just the process, not how we want it to work or how it really works. Just document a start point and an end point and the steps in between from memory. Round 2, we reviewed the process in round 1 to add missing pieces and move processes around after a more thorough review to create what really happens. In round 3, we reviewed the process steps to understand their contribution to the process. Is each value-added step, non-value-added step, waste or something the customer will pay for, and use different colored notes to define them as such. In round 4, we talked through why we feel these steps were identified and why they were added. We reviewed the waste and non-value added steps to identify process improvements, improvement opportunities in round 5. In round 6, we chose improvement opportunities through group consensus to report back to management and stakeholders for the next steps. It's important to maintain focus on the scope at hand. If we get too deep in the weeds, the people of the map is if we get too deep in the weeds, we'll lose focus. Remember, this is a tool to achieve the purpose. If you look at the map and the answers are not clear, look at the processes and comments in the parking lot for clarification. If you're still looking for answers, we'll talk about some additional tools to help add data and perspective. So let's take a pause and look how far we've come. We started with a SIPOC diagram to identify how we think the process is completed. We took that SIPOC diagram and used it as a guide to create process flowcharts. We use that flowchart to identify improvement opportunities. But at this juncture, we need to take a good hard look at our map and improvement opportunities to make sure we have enough information to move ahead. I can't stress enough because mapping activities will vary. This is something internal with a small team You may have everything you need once you finish the flow chart and get started on the improvements. However, if this is a bigger undertaking where you'll need approval and funding from leadership or other stakeholders, we want to make sure that the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed. So at this point, we may want to or need to go a step further to directly analyze the process step and questions to fully understand it. So we have all the information we need to prove the validity and success of our improvement data. At this point, we have a few options. We can go back through the SIPOC and flow charting steps that we just completed to analyze the individual process step and look deeper in the process. We can also use turtle diagrams and process charts to gain more information. So let's look at turtle diagrams. A turtle diagram looks at inputs and outputs, including resources, requirements, and responsibilities to meet customer needs. If you're thinking this sounds a lot like a SIPOC diagram, you wouldn't be wrong. The main difference between a turtle diagram and a SIPOC diagram is that a SIPOC focuses on several process steps, where the turtle diagram focuses on only one process step. You may be wondering why it's called a turtle diagram. The name comes from the fact that a finished diagram will look like a turtle. To create a turtle diagram, you start with identifying the process step in question and draw a circle around that step. That would be the body of the turtle. Next, you identify inputs and outputs of that process step, or the head and the tail. This includes any documentation, requirements, or materials necessary for the process step, as well as any documentation, requirements, or materials created by the process step. Once you have the process step, inputs, and outputs identified, now let's work on the legs or the flippers. The first flipper will include how the process is complete. The other front flipper focuses on what is done to complete the process. Moving to the back, the first back flipper includes who's responsible for completion. And finally, the last flipper outlines how we measure success or how our key performance indicators for the process. If you're not sure what the KPIs are or how to develop them, that's also something that we can assist with. Let's revisit our process map for making a cup of coffee. If you remember, one of the improvement ideas was to identify an environmentally friendly K-Cup provider. So let's look at our supplier selection procedure. First, we're going to identify our inputs and outputs. For outputs, we'll need a solid business case for making a supplier change, because there's always an internal cost and adjustment period for supplier changes. We'll also need cost targets to set parameters and the most important environmental standards, since this is our main concern. For outputs, we'll need to have a new supplier entered into our system for ordering and payment purposes, and a signed contract in place with the new supplier. To address how it's done, we'll need an evaluation criteria to ensure we judge all vendors the same and that the process is fair. Once we've selected a new vendor, we'll also need procedures for vendor approval and purchase orders to ensure that we're following the correct steps. Next, what do we require? What do we require to do this? First, we'll need to look and see how much coffee we've purchased over the years, and if there's a discount available of the vendor if they can meet our demand. We'll also need the results of the flavor survey, another improvement recommendation, to confirm the vendor has the flavors that we want. And finally, we need to search for suppliers using this information. Now that we know what we're going to do, how we're going to do it, we need to look at who will be responsible. Obviously, we need someone from purchasing and accounting, because they will be executing the vendor approval procedure and purchase orders. But we also need the coffee club president, because they, my friends, are the voice of the people. And I don't know about you, but an office is full of, if an office is full of angry people, that's a place that I don't want to be. Finally, how do we address the new supplier's performance? The simplest place to start will be on-time delivery and to make sure that we are properly caffeinated. Availability of flavors our team wants, and the cost of goods from the new supplier. Now we've mapped this step further, you can see some of the similarities to the SIPOC diagram. With that said, you could also start the mapping process using a turtle diagram in place of the SIPOC. Remember, these are just tools to help you accomplish a task, and while they make sense in a particular order, that doesn't mean you have to follow that order. Every situation and need will vary. So now that we have more data, Let's analyze the step to see what's missing or what other potential improvements may exist. When we review how we will select a new supplier, we overlook credit checks and other tasks to address the financial health of the company. We don't want to go through this process again and again. After assembling the team to conduct this work, we selected the coffee club president, but what about a group of tasters to make sure it's adequate? Without their approval, this could be a lost cause. And finally, the biggest concern is that we overlooked asking the company how they will prove the environmental responsibility of the product. This was the main reason we started down this road. I point out again because it's very easy to get caught up in the details and either miss the point or overlook the most important aspects of the activity. A process chart is another way that you can collect data about a process step in your map. This approach is fairly simple and uses a system of shapes to denote activities being completed. As you can see in the top right corner of the template, there's an option for current and proposed. This is used to communicate the use for this data. On the left side, there's a table with some shapes. The circle indicates any time a value-added step changes or transforms the material. The arrow indicates movement of people, materials, or equipment. The square is reserved for quality or quantity checks during the process. Delay is pretty self-explanatory, and it captures the time spent waiting on a process where it cannot move to the next activity for any reason. The upside-down triangle reflects any time a product or equipment is kept in storage. While these are basic shapes, remember this is highly customizable, so you can add as many shapes and icons as you want. If you do customize the shapes, don't forget to update your key. Once all the data has been collected for operation, add the total number of steps, time, and distance to complete the observations. You can then review these findings and look for improvement opportunities. As these opportunities are identified, the data can be used to update the map and estimate improvements. Remember, estimates are only as good as the data. It's best to simulate this as much as possible to ensure accuracy. So let's go back to the process flow chart again and think about quality control issue with cleaning and review the cleaning process. We're going to start by filling out the top right corner with the date, who's doing this, where, the process name, the current stage, not proposed, and our remarks. Now that we have that, let's get to the bulk of the document. You can see we started by following our coffee volunteer around, and we identified each of the tasks they completed. As they completed them, we noted what we found along the way. Now that we have everything completed for this task, we can tally the results to get a snapshot of the entire process. Now that this is complete, we can analyze the process and look for improvements. For example, maybe we can add bins for dirty or clean cups to save time in collecting and replacing cups. Maybe we can assign someone the responsibility to empty the dishwasher to save that time. As we think about these ideas, we can create a duplicate of this map and address those improvements and fill in the proposed information, then calculate the difference to understand the true impact. Again, remember, it's important to simulate this as much as possible because the math is only as good as the effort you put into the process. Now that we've gone through this entire process, I wanted to take a slide to talk about the Plan, Do, Check, Act cycle, just in case this is something you're not familiar with. Plan, Do, Check, Act is the core of continuous improvement. Based on the information gathered, we create a plan for implementing our improvement to make sure the team is on the same page. Once the plan is complete, let's put it into action and see if it works as intended. During this time, it's important to observe changes, both positive and negative, to understand the impacts of your plan. When we get to check, review the data. Did the improvement provide the intended impact? Were there other impacts that we did not anticipate? Were there negative impacts that need addressed? At that point, we need to analyze and decide the next steps. That brings us to act. We act on those next steps. If the plan was a success, we celebrate and commend those involved. But if there's a more feasible improvement opportunity, then we go back to the plan phase and start the cycle all over again. Swim lane maps are a variant of the process flow maps that we created earlier. This type of map is useful when you're trying to understand a complex, multifunctional process where there are several departments involved. As you can guess, the map gets its name from the horizontal lanes for each department and resemble a swimming competition. To create a swim lane map, Start by identifying all departments or role responsibilities for completion of this task in question. Then create a lane for each of those identified. Once complete, follow the flowchart rules we talked about previously in the webinar to define the task. One obvious variant is that those post-it notes should be placed in an appropriate swim lane to help understand the connection between the steps and those responsible. After the map is complete, the other tools we've discussed, including SIPOC, flowcharts, turtle diagrams, and process charts, can also be used to further understand the process steps involved. This is a more common process map that you've probably heard about. Value stream mapping creates a detailed visualization of every step in the process by representing the flow of goods from your supply chain to your customer as it goes through your company. The purpose of this map is to identify areas where non-value added tasks and time exists that you can identify improvement projects to reduce or eliminate the non-value added time and waste. When value stream maps are created, they're done in two versions. First is the current state map. This map identifies the process as it is today, no matter how good, bad, or ugly. Next, analysis is completed to identify the future state map, which is how we want the process to work. The gap that exists between these two process maps is bridged by identifying continuous improvement projects and developing a continuous improvement plan for implementation. As you can see from the example, there's a lot of data required. Not only do we need to map the process itself, but look at the time and resources involved to successfully complete the process. For some smaller companies, data collection can be overwhelming, but keep in mind, many of the tools that we talked about today can help. Starting with process flow maps and using process charts for data collection are an excellent foundation to help build value stream maps. Now time for the last poll. Since we don't have enough time to go through these other two mapping options in depth, which of the two maps that I just reviewed would you be interested in learning about? All right, Jamie, put it on the books. Value stream maps it is. All right, like Smokey and the Bandit, we had a long way to go and a short time to get there. We talked about what process mapping is, who should do it, and why it's important. We started with understanding purpose and detail required to establish a goal for our mapping activity. With that in mind, we created a SIPOC diagram to get a high-level understanding of our process and create the scope for our activity. This is critical because it's easy to get lost in the weeds when trying to complete mapping activities. We took that SIPOC diagram, broke it down further into a process flow chart, completing several passes over the chart to better understand the process and improvement opportunities. We then talked about turtle diagrams and process charts as additional tools to focus on a particular process step and then add additional data or value to the process. And then we rounded out our time with a quick review of two additional mapping tools, swim lane maps and value stream mapping. If I can leave you with anything about these tools, I've said it several times throughout this webinar. These tools are just that, they're tools. Use them as you see fit in a way that supports growth and the success of your company. Far too often, I see people get caught up in using these tools for the sake of the tool and not using them to look into their processes. I welcome you to take what you've learned today here, modify it in any way possible, as long as you get the data you need and improve the processes and make a positive impact on your business. And that's it. Do we have any questions?
All right, great job, Randy. I learned a lot. That was good stuff. Really, really good stuff. Pretty complex topic, and you broke it down into some nice parts there. We did get a few questions here, if you want to answer those. And anybody who does have additional questions, now is the time to put those in the chat. But one of the questions that came through was, how many people should be a part of this activity?
there's no real correct answer for that, but I've found the most success with 3 to 5 people. And like I said, you want to have somebody who is the go-to person on that process. And then maybe if you have somebody else that moonlights over there every once in a while, get them on there. And then bring somebody in from accounting, bring somebody in that has no idea what the process is, because most people can look at a process and say, hey, that makes sense, or why do you do that? Most people can connect the dots, even if they don't deal with it every single day. They won't know the in-depth stuff, but they can figure out those high-level things.
Okay, great. Thanks. And let's see. Does your department offer any consulting services to get a department started? Wow, and that was not a plan. Thank you, Rhonda. But yeah, go ahead and answer that, Randy.
Yeah, we do consulting services on all the things we just talked about.
Yeah, we'll be happy to set that up with you. You can contact Randy directly or anybody on our team, and we can discuss best processes to help you get started. So yes, we're happy to do that for any organization. That's great. And oh, hey, Katie. Katie asked if the webinar will be recorded, and yes, it will. We'll be sending this out probably early next week. And just so everybody knows, for future reference, if you register for the webinar, you'll get a copy of the recording. So yeah, we'll send out the slides and the recording early next week. And if you haven't been getting those, I usually send them as a BCC. Email me directly and let me know, because those have been going out. So let's see here. There's also the question of, should I map the entire process at once or do it piece by piece?
It just depends on what the scale of it is. With smaller companies, you can probably get the whole team together, and depending on how many processes you have, you can just work through it and take care of it in a day. Just stamp where you're at. How long would it take them to do theirs? They're a nice big company, and it would take days to take care of their processes. So I don't think you could take it on all at once. You would have to break that one down.
Okay. And let's see. Oh, do we need special software or tools, or can this be done in a room with a whiteboard? That's a great question. Thank you.
It can be done in a room with a whiteboard. And sometimes that's the easiest thing. And once you build it out, you don't need to go into Excel or try to have Visio or do anything complicated. Once you have it done with your Post-it notes on a wall, take a picture of it, file it away.
Yeah, and
it's a nice team building activity to have everybody over there and work through this. So yeah, that is the best way I've found to do it, is a whiteboard and some Post-it notes, because it's easy to shuffle around. You can have everybody together and you just work through it. You get a lot of good input.
Yeah, and anybody who saw the picture that was actually in the promotional piece for this webinar, that was a series of Post-it notes up at NCS, National Church Solutions, up in Chester. That wasn't staged. That was a picture I took while I was in their conference room, where they had been doing just this process on their walls. So yeah, Post-it notes work great.
That's a great process. Mapping is fantastic. It's the DNA of your organization. Without those processes, you couldn't be successful, and you can always improve on those processes. And a lot of places are too scared to bring in, they won't bring in the person from accounting or the person from across the plant, because, well, what do they know? But most people can look at a process and just understand at a high level, hey, this is what we're doing. And sometimes it takes somebody from the outside to say, hey, why are you doing this? And then you look at it and go, because we've always done it that way. And then you start digging into it and you can make some big improvements.
Sure. All right. Well, want to be respectful of everybody's time and give them time to find a good seat to at least catch most of the second, or catch all of the second half and some of the first half of the Mountaineer game. I'm sure there's lots of people who are much more interested in you, Randy. Don't worry about that. But
that's right.
Thank you, everybody, for coming, and thank you for a great presentation, Randy. Don't forget.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. Thanks, everybody.